Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back, everybody. Tim, can you please haul them all into order for me? Thank you. Right, we're up to item 12, Plan Change 14, Staging Decision. And I know this is quite a complex report, so Mark's going to talk us through it. And I've got my trusty advisor, John Higgins, here in case we get some super curly questions. So fire away, Mark.
Thank you very much. So the purpose of this report is to indicate to the Independent Hearings Panel now what Council intends to decide on in September and what it intends to delay hearing. So it's consideration of which parts of Plan Change 14 the Council wants to decide on in September and which parts it wants to delay to a decision by September of next year. It's fair to say Council's initial notification of Plan Change 14 there was concerns or reservations about medium density residential standards that had been introduced and the law required us to implement. The new government came in October and said that it was going to change the law to make medium density residential standards optional. And it has signalled further that it intends to introduce a bill later this year to proceed with that. In light of that early indication from the government, the Council resolved at its 6th of December meeting to ask the Minister to delay Plan Change 14 and the decisions on it until after medium density residential standards had been made optional. That would have enabled Council to reconsider the medium density residential standards and to tailor Plan Change 14 to a Christchurch or Ōtautahi solution. The Minister did respond and most recently issued a Gazette notice which requires decisions on those parts of Plan Change 14 that implement policies 3 and 4 of the National Policy Statement by September 24, so that's this September. But it doesn't need to make decisions on the balance of Plan Change 14 until by September of next year. So, in effect, just with reference to the image on the right-hand side, which is for indicative purposes only, the green areas represent commercial centres, including the central city. The red dashed areas around those centres represent a walkable catchment from those centres. And within those areas, higher densities and heights of development have been proposed through Plan Change 14. So within those red dashed lines, the Minister is expecting a decision on Plan Change 14 for those areas by September this year. Outside of those red lines, he's anticipating a decision later. Delaying the decisions on those areas outside the red lines until the law changes enables Council to consider what it does in those areas outside the red lines later, and that's subject to Council's decision in September. But the reason we've come to you today ahead of September is to say this is an opportunity for you to signal to the Independent Hearings Panel what you want decisions on by this September, recognising that we are required to implement policies 3 and 4 of the National Policy Statement, and to do that is to enable intensification inside those red dashed lines. Also within those red dashed lines is a given that we must implement medium density residential standards. That's the carpet that the Mayor previously described as being beneath what is required to implement the MPS. Within the walkable distances of the central city is the Sydenham area, and what is recommended in option 1 of the report is that in addition to intensification within those red dashed areas, we also recommend rezoning of the Sydenham area to mixed use. But unlike those aspects which are within the red lines, we're saying we think it would be appropriate that you make decisions in September on requiring financial contributions across the whole city for tree canopy cover, recognising the benefits that brings in mitigating the effects of intensification. For the areas outside the red lines, we have the benefit of time, and the question is really what you'll want to make decisions on later, after September this year and before September next year. Questions we'll need to consider at a future date is, does council want to see medium density residential standards outside the red dashed lines? What, if any, intensification should be enabled outside those red dashed lines which represent MPS areas? And what, if any, additional rules do we consider at the interface between where a high density zone is proposed within the red dashed lines and outside of that because of the height difference? So there's a lot of information in the report, but to simplify it, there's effectively 4 options: the preferred option and then 3 others. The second and third options are very similar to the first one. The key difference is financial contributions. Ultimately, there's a question of do you want to make decisions in September on financial contributions for tree canopy cover only within MPS areas as per option 2, across the whole city as per option 1, or not to make any decision on financial contributions until a later time? The fourth option is needs to be on the table, and that is to make a decision this September on the whole of Plan Change 14, regardless of the opportunity the Minister's provided for staging of the decision. The fourth option is on the table in recognition that the IHP have already expressed some difficulty at this late stage to unpick all aspects of the plan change, and this resolution, whilst it does enable the council to signal to the IHP what it wants to make decisions on in September, ultimately we're to some extent in the hands of the IHP of how they split their recommendations. After receipt of those recommendations from the IHP in July, staff will endeavour to achieve a split consistent with the council decision today in our advice and recommendations to council in September, but there will be some challenges with that, hence option 4. So just to sum up, in terms of timeline, today we're asking you for a decision to signal to the IHP. That signal to the IHP would be reflected in council's right of reply to the IHP by the 17th of May, which is when legal submissions are filed with the IHP. That is the last milestone for the hearings of the IHP before they start to deliberate and prepare their recommendations. Their recommendations will be received by the 26th of July, and thereafter council needs to make a decision, and by the 12th of September, the meeting we're aiming for of council is the 4th of September. And the decision council makes on the 4th of September will have ramifications, recognising that if there's any recommendations the IHP have that the council rejects, then the minister makes the decision. Other things to consider are those questions I posed earlier about what council does post-September this year outside the red dash line, and that will be dependent on the timing for amendments the government makes to make MDRS optional. Recognising that there will be a need for further work after September this year, including a plan change or variation to deal with areas outside the red line. Ultimately, we need to work to completion of the Plan Change 14 process by September next year.
Right, well actually that clarifies things reasonably well. And right, Sam's happy to move it. Councillor MacDonald, do we have a seconder? Councillor Henstock, you're moving option 1, the staff recommendation. Do we have any questions?
Well, I'd like to, in my foreshadowing, moving option 4.
Do you have a seconder for that? All right, we'll go with some questions. Do we need a seconder for foreshadowing now, or when? Okay. Councillor Coker.
If we choose option 1, will we still hear, this is what I'm hearing, that we'll still hear the IHP's recommendations on the MDRS areas outside the MPSUD, is that correct?
That's right. So the IHP will be giving us a report with their recommendations on all areas of the city. They have indicated the challenges, but they have also indicated they'll consider how they can split their recommendations to the extent possible. So ultimately what council could be deciding in September is part of the IHP's recommendations, recognising they will also be giving us recommendations on other parts of the city.
Right. And if we were to choose option 4 and the IHP recommends MDRS outside NPSUD areas, and say the council was to reject that and it went to the minister, what do you think that possible outcome might be of that? Because if it's not required, then the minister would likely, I presume, accept what the council's decision is. Is that correct?
I can't preempt what the minister may decide if left with the decision on areas outside, but what the minister has signalled to date in prescribing that we have to make decisions by September on MPSC areas is that he wants to see sufficient capacity provided for housing and business growth, and a key point is MDRS won't be optional until after legislation is passed to make it optional. So the minister may still, in making a decision on the balance of Plan Change 14 that's rejected by council, decide he does in fact want to see MDRS applied. Right. It could be it's either that or a variant of, or no MDRS. But when council makes its decision in September this year, and thereafter the minister potentially makes a decision on what council rejects, that will be before any optionality for MDRS has been passed, because the bill was only being introduced later this year. The outside those red dashed lines, that there's, if council makes a decision that rejects any of the IHP's recommendations, just to re-emphasise, that goes to the minister. There is the option for council, where it's only wanting to make decisions on part of what is recommended by the IHP, to remain silent and not make decisions outside MPS areas, in which case it would not fall to the minister, because it only, my understanding is it only falls to the minister if the council outright rejects the IHP recommendations. Council has the option to delay a decision on some of the recommendations to a later date if it so wishes.
And if we were to choose option 4, would we be able to delay anyway?
Ultimately, the decision today could be superseded by your decision in September, insofar as you could decide today you want to see all of Plan Change 14 decided. Because that's sending a signal to the IHP may then decide, because of that, council doesn't want the recommendations to be split to the extent that council perhaps earlier proposed. So it's quite important today, if council wants to signal a split, that it makes that clear to the IHP. If there's a scenario of council saying to the IHP from today's meeting that it wants to make a decision on all of Plan Change 14, the risk with that is the IHP just give us one whole package without any indication of the split.
But they may well give us an indication in any case. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'll second option 4.
Councillor Henstock?
Thank you, Mark. In your paper at page 165, you in, where are we, 4.23C, you're talking about the disadvantages with option 4 for the whole of Plan Change 14, and you refer to the inefficiencies in relation to time and cost of any appeals. For those who haven't been involved in this process before, can you just explain a little bit what that appeal process looks like in terms of time and cost, and particularly the implications on resource for council, and where you think those appeals would come from if we were to adopt Plan 4 now? Thanks.
In the context of the paper, option 4, just confirming paragraph 4.23C, the last bullet point there. So option 4 is council making a decision on all of Plan Change 14. If at a later date, when medium density residential standards are made optional, council were to decide we want to undo that earlier decision and take away development rights, including medium density residential standards in some areas, because we don't think it's the best outcome. To do that and undo those development rights requires a plan change process. That plan change process would be under a standard RMA process that would allow a right of appeal to the Environment Court and thereafter higher courts on the council decision at the end of that plan change process. That's quite unlike this current process for Plan Change 14, where there's no appeal rights beyond judicial review. So the decisions that council makes in September cannot be appealed. Someone can pursue a judicial review, but not appeal to the Environment Court or higher, like a normal RMA plan change process. So if council wanted to undo or change any aspect of what it decides in September, it would come potentially with a significant costs of challenge from parties who may benefit or be disadvantaged by any decisions council makes.
Can you just touch on that? What is the length of these usual appeals if it does have to be undone? Is it something that can be dealt with within 6 months, or do these things go on for years?
I'd estimate 12 to 24 months.
Thank you. Councillor Templeton?
Thank you. Just a couple of quick questions. Firstly, the areas that are currently outside the NPSUD kind of areas, just the broader NDRS, how much social housing is currently being held up by the delay in decision on NDRS? Do we know?
I don't know at this moment. Certainly, there has been some developers, landowners who have relied on medium density residential standards in lodging applications, which have been on hold in some instances. The precise quantum is unknown, but a number of those parties are also submitted to the plan change process.
Okay, but overall though, not just social housing, it could be thousands of homes currently waiting on MDRS decisions?
No. My understanding is it's much less than that.
Right.
If I can ask the principal advisor,
Yeah, I think it's a small amount because there's special provisions already in the district plan for social housing, which allow multi-unit social housing. So they're not that reliant on these new provisions.
Great. The other one is just on our capacity for other plan changes. So we've got some other plan changes, and we had the workshop yesterday. My key concern, for example, is plan change 12. Which of the options gives us the best capacity to be doing other plan changes and as soon as possible?
Just looking at it purely in terms of capacity of the team to advance other work, without consideration of other factors, I would suggest option 4, only because option 4 enables decisions on all of Plan Change 14 and is on the assumption that council later does not seek to undo any of those decisions on Plan Change 14. That's on the basis that if council makes decisions on all of Plan Change 14 this September, then it would not leave any further decisions to be made on Plan Change 14, nor give rise to any variation or plan change unless council sought to alter that earlier decision when MDRS becomes optional.
Yeah. And the only reason we would be open to any appeals and those kind of things on that is if we deliberately decided to do another plan change to undo some of the provisions we'd just approved. Is that right?
Under option 4, there would not be that risk.
Any appeals?
That risk that I flagged earlier in response to Councillor Henstock's question comes with a future plan change or variation.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Henstock, then Councillor Johansson.
Well, thank you. Just supplementary to Councillor Templeton's question, you've answered that option number 4 is best from a capacity perspective, but am I correct that you've said that with the assumption that there isn't any further change in September that we want to undo it?
Correct.
And if there was a plan change, would your answer to that change?
Yes, it would.
Yeah, thank you.
So Mark, can you just once again clarify the purpose of this report is about whether we split it or not?
The purpose of this report is to signal to the IHP how council wants to split its decision in September, and for the IHP to have an understanding of that they can then split their recommendations to the extent possible.
Yeah, bearing in mind that they will make up their own mind about what they want to do, but this is a signal.
Correct.
The option 1 is a signal.
Correct.
Are there any other questions? Oh, Councillor Johansson, sorry. And Councillor Kieran, did you have one?
Yeah, just wanted to check where we've got to with the social impact assessment. Like, is that being considered? Because the feedback I'm getting from a lot of these communities where we've got intensification is it's having a really adverse impact just from things like access. So I just wanted to make sure that there's a process underway to mitigate or understand what the impacts are.
So as part of council's evidence, there was a report prepared on social impacts of intensification. Council has subsequently called an expert in social impacts, Ms. Rebecca Foy, who has given evidence to the independent hearings panel of the effects of intensification in regards to social impacts,
Right.
and I can share that with you.
Okay. And so do at a high level, in terms of the options that we're considering today, is one likely to have a greater social impact than the other?
I can't answer that, I'm afraid. I haven't done that evaluation in terms of
Right.
the different social impacts of each option.
Okay. And then just one thing that I just wanted to understand is, like, who's doing the traffic modelling? Like, we had a really good presentation yesterday about growth, and obviously, there's a number of issues that arise around. I understand the car parking rules, that like we can't require car parking, but things like safety of access, and design of driveways, etc., on some of these streets. And I'm just thinking about the Linwood one in particular. Is the one that I know about. But what's happening in that space? Is that being done through the plan change, or is that being done through infrastructure design standards or subdivision consents? I don't just quite understand how we are mitigating that risk.
So there's two aspects to it. The transport rules and the district plan control have standards on access, design and other aspects, and council can, is as part of Plan Change 14, introducing some changes to the transport chapter, an example being requiring a wider width of access to rear lots for fire and emergency access, namely on the hills. And those transport rules continue to apply. Notwithstanding that, the council's ability to decline or impose additional standards that would restrict medium density housing in accordance with the government standards is limited. So we're constrained in so far as we can't reject applications based on the traffic impacts if they can be mitigated to some extent. Infrastructure in general, stormwater, wastewater, transport effects of intensification, council has been very much limited in what it can put forward by way of controls in that space. The government's been clear that high evidence threshold is required to justify limitations on intensification for those reasons, and we've pursued an argument where there's vacuum sewer constraints in Shirley, Aranui and Preston's because of the sewer capacity and the sheer costs of upgrading that, but it's more difficult to mitigate, to argue that the level of investment and mitigation of traffic effects cannot be managed, and so we're required to enable intensification even where there is upgrades
So
required.
we're getting right down into the definition of it. What we're talking about here now is whether to split the decision. Have you finished your questions, Yanni? Because
Yeah, I guess the question is, in terms of resources, are we like we're having to fully fund this ourselves, right? Like the government has not contributed anything to this process, despite it costing us millions of dollars?
We reached out early on. The government has funded a friend of the submitter to assist submitters, but it's otherwise fallen to the councils to implement these standards.
Right.
So once again, that's not really relevant to what we're deciding today.
Well, sorry, in relation to Sarah's question around, does this mean like other stuff's just not going to happen that's more a priority for the community because we have to do this?
Well,
And so we have a choice
resourcing
between...
issue, and
what option
Mark
we
has
have.
answered there.
Yep.
Councillor Kewen?
Yeah, just wanted to clarify that any of today's decisions have no impact, either way, negative or positive, on what happens around the airport and the contour lines and stuff. Is there any crossover?
There is some
Positive or negative?
So as part of Plan Change 14, Council's position has been to put forward a qualifying matter which restricts intensification within the airport noise contour as remodelled, but based on the current policy settings of a 50 decibel airport contour.
Did we not write to those involved in the process asking for it to change to 55 like everywhere else?
So that decision, or our request for that, will come through the regional policy statement, which will be introduced in December this year, and we'll be able to make a submission on that point.
It's a couple of years late.
Ahead of that process, we are continuing to rely on the current policy framework, which is 50. And within the 50 remodelled contour, we're proposing our recommendation to the IHP is to limit intensification within the contour and to limit the level of intensification generally to the operative rules. That's until the RPS has gone through the process of review.
And then it would change? So is that more work again?
So when the RPS is reviewed, we can have the discussion about whether it's the 50 or 55 or variant of, and thereafter we can consider what that means for the district plan.
Thank you. Councillor McDonald?
Thank you. Just one. So in option 4, the disadvantages, it talks about the outcomes for the OTA Christchurch. Outcomes for OTA Christchurch defined by Plan Change 14 may not be what is sought by the council and its community. So is that sort of, and I'm just trying to clarify in my mind, what you're saying is because the council initially rejected the plan, we then agreed to write to the minister for an exemption. By deciding on option 4 today would effectively be eroding trust and confidence in the communities because we're forcing them into a position in September.
The basis of that disadvantage is that there's a lot of submitters in this Plan Change 14 process, a number of whom are opposed to intensification or the level of intensification that is proposed in Plan Change 14. The IHP may come, of course, to a different view to what Council's recommended, but those concerns may still not be satisfied by the recommendations of the IHP, insofar as the IHP will still be required to implement the national policy statement, which requires greater heights around Riccarton, for instance, and therefore there won't necessarily be an outcome that is consistent with what some of those submitters have argued.
Yeah. So then, and this may not be a question to answer, but don't worry if you can't. I'm just thinking in terms of like good decision making in terms of the Local Government Act and people having enough time to come and submit. Do you think it's likely that if people thought we were jumping to an all plan submission in September or an approval in September, that they would be here today making deputations?
I think it'd be reasonable to put, we can't answer yes or no, but we can talk about the context. So the context is the council notified the plan change containing MDRS, not because it wanted to, but because the law said it had to.
Yep.
And then when the new government came in saying that MDRS was going to be optional, the council in December said, right, let's ask to put it all on hold because we don't want MDRS outside of the Policy 3 and Policy 4 areas. So that's what the council asked to do and resolved to do in December. Option 1 is being recommended here partly just because it's consistent with council's previous decisions.
Thank you. That's great. Yeah.
And
Cool.
Councillor Scandrick?
Yeah, just with the concern I asked before about is this holding development up. The information that we got yesterday was that the consents issued were just over 7,000 for over 11,600 dwellings, with over almost 4,500 of them already built. So I mean, it doesn't seem to be any slackening off at the moment of building. So is this just going forward until the decision's made?
The consent numbers don't show any indication of slowing down.
Yeah.
There are still applications for multi-unit development coming in. A key point to make is Council's case to the IHP has been that there is not a capacity shortfall, unlike other large cities. We do have enough capacity to meet that demand. Implementing the MPS on urban development does add to that capacity around centres and along corridors. But we've said in our correspondence to the Mayor's correspondence to the Minister that we don't have a capacity issue that warrants MDRS being applied.
Because my understanding is that in 2013 I went to a parliamentary hearing, and actually with you, Brenda, with regards to our ability with our planning, and we had capacity out to 2038 in 2013, and that kind of asked them to leave us alone and let us do our thing, and obviously they didn't listen to that. But so that was where we were 10 years ago. So, and we're still there.
The Minister certainly has acknowledged Christchurch's capacity, but considers we also need to implement the MPS to enable greater capacity over and above that.
Right, thank you.
30 years from now. So, if there are no more questions, is there any debate? It's been moved and seconded. Is there any debate on this? All right, if not, I'll put... Have you got debate? Feel free to begin.
Thank you. Well, I think the Housing Minister put it quite rightly this week, actually, that the housing crisis is a disgrace. And the truth is that Council has contributed towards that crisis over a number of years, putting excessive amounts of red tape, making it harder to build housing and more expensive to do so, adding huge amounts of costs. Our university in Christchurch right now is going absolutely gangbusters. This is a really good thing. Young people want to move to Christchurch because of housing costs. But that success will be short-lived, because how our council are responding right now, while there is a shortage of housing around the uni, our response is, let's resist making it more affordable to build housing around the university. We continually talk about making Selwyn and Waimak pay for things, but at the same time, we're making it more expensive to build housing in Christchurch. So sure enough, we're losing ratepayers to Selwyn and to Waimak. You put red tape up in front, and it's no longer economical to build housing here. So yesterday we saw this huge list of plan changes that council needs to crack on with, and we've got limited resources to handle them. So we've got to get on and make a decision. To tie up more staff resources for yet another year doesn't seem sustainable in any way, shape or form to me. Also, what we're seeing here is it's pushing on with intensification even in outer suburbs, but in inner suburbs, we're saying we'll wait another year. So it'll be less economical to build housing in some of those inner suburbs. So sure enough, developers will target outer suburbs, which adds to congestion, and it goes against where it's practical to actually build more housing. So this process has already actually taken 3 years. That's 3 years worth of resources. That's 3 years worth of public hearings, submissions, the lot. We're basically fighting to increase the rates burden, and we've put resources even into saying we can't possibly build more housing by Riccarton Mall because there's a bush nearby. I don't think that's a good use of resources. To try and say that 100 metres away from the bush, if you build 2 stories, that's fine, but if it's 3 stories, somehow that'll jeopardise the bush. Is this really where we should be putting resources? I don't think it is. We wonder why central government has had to force council's hand. Here's a classic example. We hum and we ha. We're 3 years into a process. We're saying we can't possibly make a decision. We need to spend another year on it. Meanwhile, more and more people end up in emergency accommodation. Housing still continues to get more unaffordable, and some people are not ready to make a decision yet. It's time to actually show some leadership and put this thing to a vote one way or the other. We've still got a few months. We've had 3 years. How long do we possibly need? Whatever there's the political willpower to do, then so be it. But to wait another year and put all these resources into something, I think it is time to show leadership. We need to put this thing to a vote. It can't drag on years after years. People are waiting for homes. Developers have got their developments on hold, because if they know it'll be cheaper to build things soon, not just for 3 stories either, it would still make it cheaper to build 2 stories. So they've got no certainty. So there are developments on hold. The numbers we've seen to that consents have dropped off. So let's just put this thing to a vote in September one way or the other and move on.
Thank you, Councillor Templeton.
Kia ora, thank you. I'm somewhat torn on this one because I know that developing and adding more density around our key activity centres first is probably better for the transport system overall and people's sort of walkability and those kind of things. But I also know that if we split this decision, that the likely outcome of that is actually getting rid of the medium density standards altogether, because it's not simply splitting the decision, it's delaying the second half till a time where council can effectively vote not to do it at all. And that's bad for our housing supply altogether, like Councillor Moore has just said. So we must remember as well that this isn't the MDRS that the government initially proposed, that because we delayed initially, said no, and then watered it down significantly, what we have notified is an MDRS standards that effectively is only around the major public transport routes. It's well away from the coast where we're unlikely to have coastal hazards and tsunami risk, those kind of things. And it's in areas that will actually mean density around our public transport routes. So I think that on balance, given the capacity of our staff and the need to progress our coastal hazards plan change, that on balance, I would prefer that we did the whole thing all together. And so that's the way I'll be voting today.
What did she say? Councillor Peters.
Thank you. This is a huge decision for our city. This decision to either go forward at breakneck speed and do everything all at once in September is risky. And I've always said that we need to, in doing any intensification, be able to do it on our terms as Christchurch, rather than having what's been forced on us by government, their terms. So hitting the pause button on the MDRS outside of the red areas, I think is wisdom, because we've got one chance to get this right for our city. If we let the genie out of the bottle and the city starts developing inappropriately in the outer suburbs piecemeal, you're not going to be able to put that cap back on the genie later. So we've got to make sure we get this right. So the MDRS, should it happen outside the red areas, is done on more of our terms than on the central government terms and Auckland and Wellington models. So hitting the pause button to do the second decision by September next year is wisdom. And that's where, as a council, we need to be brave enough to allow that pause to happen so that we can hear what the government's going to be proposing and putting through as legislation, so that we do have more chance to get it absolutely right for our ratepayers. The ratepayers are telling us quite clearly that they don't want to see the genie out of the bottle and piecemeal development happening right through the odd little pockets of the city. We're getting it around the transport hubs and around the main centres is needing to be done because the MPS requires us to, so let's do that. But let's not be fooled by the idea that you're guaranteed to get more affordable, cheaper housing out of this, because I don't believe you will. Affordability is not down to how easy it is to get your resource consent. Yes, that's a small piece of it, but the main part of the equation here is the affordability of the building actually being done by the builders with their materials, with their labour. It's not about how long it takes to get resource consent. So please don't be fooled by the push to say more affordable housing will automatically come out of this, because the developers are always going to make their money. So let's have the pause. Let's be brave enough to make the decisions we have to make by September, and then we can, by the September next year, look at the idea of doing what we have to do there. Thank you.
Good on Councillor Scandrett.
Yeah, thank you. The term red tape is a very emotive term, but what it is actually protecting the consumer. If you talk to individuals that have lived through leaky homes, that was all well and good, and oh yes, no, it's all up to standard, but the standard had actually been dropped. And if you talk to families that have lived through it with mould and leaky homes for years and the health of their children, you would say to them, what do you think about red tape? They'd probably say, actually, we want more because we want a protected standard. There will always be developers and individuals that will build to the minimum standard. And if we look at the building at the moment, you can go to Australia, buy the same products that are for sale here, put them all in a container, ship them back to New Zealand and build the same house, but for half the cost. There is a problem with the whole system here in New Zealand, and it needs to be dealt with. It's the numbers of more and more building isn't bringing down the cost of buying. There's been no adjustment with regards to that. So I think that we've got to, as a council, we have a responsibility to protect the individual ratepayer, to allow them to move into a home or a unit or whatever they choose, which is built to the highest standard possible. And I will be supporting this to ensure that. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fields.
Kia ora. I really have my my mind changed during debate, actually, and so I'd like to firstly thank and congratulate Councillor Moore on doing that for me. The second thing I'd like to say, so I would be supporting his foreshadow motion, and secondly, just within all of the options, I think it's important to note that the opportunity to rezone Sydenham, as a general thing, is one of the best and important decisions we could be making during this term, because what that is doing is sending us in a direction to make right some of the terrible decision making that council has made in the past in destroying what was once a thriving and beautiful inner city suburb, and having the opportunity to make that right. So I'm regardless of the decision we make here today, I just think it's just really important to note that. I think that Sydenham as a part of Christchurch has the opportunity to thrive, and that's a good thing.
Right, Councillor Johansson.
Thank you. I think it's a shame that this gets mixed up with the debate about housing affordability, because the reality is in Christchurch, if you look at both the short term and the long term, we have an oversupply of capacity in terms of feasible capacity. So within the next 3 years, within the next 10 years, going out to 2031, according to the evidence that we have a feasible capacity of 101,000 for housing, and we have a surplus of 83,000, right? That's in the 10 years. And in the 50-year program, to 2051, we have a long-term surplus of about 60,000. So this is not a capacity issue in terms of zoning. The affordability issue is much greater than that. It is around how we're providing housing, and some of the speakers have already pointed to that. It's a distribution problem to who's getting access to housing and how is that being done. And so when you think about what this does for affordability, this actually provides more expensive townhouses in neighbourhoods where we have traditionally more affordable housing for people that are just trying to get a first home. So I don't agree that building more expensive townhouses in lower socioeconomic communities addresses the housing affordability issue. We need to be much more deliberative about that. And I think, we've just adopted, finally, after about 4 years of being overdue, a housing strategy for Greater Christchurch. And there's a number of direct interventions in there that I think will do far more to address housing affordability than just rezoning land when we already have a surplus of capacity. So I don't like this plan change. I don't agree with the things that are in it. I think there's fundamental problems with what this does to our infrastructure, both from an environmental point of view, in terms of sustainability, and in terms of the loss of the green trees and environmental impacts like that, but also around just the sheer capacity of some of these neighbourhoods to have hundreds and hundreds of cars, vehicles, people without the infrastructure being put in place. So I don't support doing this all at once. I think we need to take a much more considered approach to addressing housing affordability. And so the more deliberate we can be around the other things that we're going to do ahead of making the planning changes, I think the better we will be.
Councillor Henstock.
Thank you. Today's debate isn't about the merits of MDRS. Today it's about the process. And one of the things that I've learned in my time at council here is that it's not so much what we do that really matters, it's how we do it. Because we know that a lot of people don't like change. They're really uncomfortable with change. But if we want to make change for good, then we have to take our residents with us, and our businesses and the people that matter to us as elected members. And there are many people that are feeling rushed by this and felt that this was imposed on them and they're overwhelmed by it. So we have an opportunity here through this process to just slow it down a bit and to do it properly and a bit more thoughtfully. And I think we'd be mad not to do that. I'd like to recognise the matters that Councillor Johansson has just raised, and I agree with him. This is not a silver bullet for our housing issues. It's a much broader conversation. And I think in that vein, this is a really complex issue. It's not a one-size-fits-all for everybody, and we've got some really skilled and experienced staff who are working and guiding us on this, and they've given us a really clear recommendation today, notwithstanding some of the questions that have been asked and the issues around our abilities and from a resourcing perspective, and they've got the recommendation to support option 1, and that's what I'll be supporting today. Thank you.
Thank you. So just before Councillor McDonald wraps up, I'll just briefly say, look, I think that we previously asked the government to, or the minister, to look at giving us the opportunity to exempt ourselves from a blanket approach, and he's given us that kind of little bit of leeway at the moment. If we don't support option 1, we're actually giving a mixed signal, I think. We're going back on what we actually asked for in the first place. So I'll be supporting option 1 definitely, because it provides also for our tree protection, which I'm passionate about. So these things do take time. You know, planning and district planning take years and years. They're not something we can rush. And particularly, as Councillor Henstock and Peter's alluded to, we need to get this right. The other factor here is that this is not a done deal. Whatever we recommend is not a done deal. The independent hearings panel will come back with their own recommendation to us. So we're actually just creating ourselves a bit of a buffer zone here. They could come back with option 4. I don't know. So this is actually protecting us and standing by what we've already asked for and sticking to our original intention. And I think also respecting the voice of the people that have spoken very loudly on this, because the blanket approach is a big shock to Christchurch. So partly this approach that we're looking at is going slowly, more gently, and actually letting it evolve. We know there's not a capacity issue in Christchurch, and we know that intensifying housing is not actually addressing affordability, so let's get this right. So I'll be supporting option 1 and hope you do too. And on that note, I'll hand over. Did you want to speak, Councillor Barber? Well, you're a bit late, but because it's your birthday, I'll allow it.
Finally, it pays off. Yeah, look, I just wanted to chime in too. I think this is sensible. I agree with the staff recommendation. I agree that it's about the process that Councillor Henstock mentioned. I think it's smart to pause. We have time. We're not overwhelmed by capacity, by people. And we wanted more control, and we've got it, and so we should take it, and we need to carry people with us. People don't like change. And I think we can we can make an intelligent decision. So let's take the time to make the right decision. I agree.
Kia ora.
Cheers.
And finally, Councillor McDonald to wrap up.
Thank you. I think that's been a really good debate, actually, and people have put issues on the table. I just firstly want to acknowledge that the one that we've moved will not be popular with developers in the city, but I'm okay with that. I think actually we need to take the communities forward, and the reality is that this doesn't do that. I want to acknowledge Helen Broughton, who's here today, and I think about all the other people that would be here if they thought that option 4, the major approach, would have been decided on today. I worry about the trust and confidence that would place in council if we were to do that today in what would be under the cover of darkness. The reality is that people need to be taken, like Pauline and Victoria have said, on the journey. The minister has not forced their hand on this. If anything, they've given us an option which we should utilise. This is consistent with what we have said from day one when we rejected the initial plan, and we're moving through at a softly approach, which gets us to a good outcome as a community. So I think it would be while it might not be supporting developers today, the reality is that communities will be better off because actually, there'll be trust and confidence in the process we're doing, and I would be really worried if we didn't do that.
Kia ora. All right, I'll put the motion. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Opposed? Do you want division?
No.
Call for division.
So this is a division for the officer recommendation, which is option 1, PC 14 item. Councillor Templeton,
No.
Councillor McClellan,
Yes.
Councillor McDonald,
Yes.
Councillor Johansson, Councillor Fields,
No.
Councillor Moore,
No.
Councillor Donovan.
No.
Thank you.
Sorry, what was that?
There's a no. Councillor Coker. Councillor Peters,
Yes.
Councillor Scandrett,
Yes.
Councillor Barber,
Yes.
Councillor Kewen. Councillor Goff,
Yes.
Councillor Hinstock,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor.
Aye.
That's 10-4, 5 against.
So that's carried. Thank you. That was a good debate. Right, so that takes us to, thank you for the work, staff. Thank you, John. Right, moving on to item 30.